You may want to, as we go along here, keep almost an extra sheet of paper to list these men in their groups instead of just one, and then we'll discuss him, and two, and we'll discuss him, and so forth. Just because it'd be easier to look, if you've got time and you want to do this, because it'd be easier to see all of them, on one piece of paper. We've looked at Westminster A and B, Old Testament and New Testament, which gave us the epistles and which gave us Genesis to Kings, the first part of the Bible. And here we're going to begin with the epistles. We just listed this, we divided this group up: Westminster, Old Testament, 10 men, New Testament, 7 men, although we haven't discussed the New Testament men yet by name. So we've gone from 1 all the way through 10 here. And we'll go 1 through 7 over here. So we've completed the first group at Westminster, the Old Testament. Lancelot Andrewes is the chairman, and he's certainly the most brilliant in the group. And not just because of that, but partly so, he's the most illustrious of the group as well. John Overall would be the other important man, which was number 7 here. John Overall. Those would be the 2 important ones from that group. Remember, they gave us the Pentateuch and the historical books. So much of that probably coming from Lancelot Andrewes himself, because he was so precise and so perfect in his translation that it could hardly be improved upon. Next we come to, which we're going to start with this morning, the New Testament, the epistles. This would be Romans through Jude. Not only Pauline epistles, but the other epistles as well. Romans through Jude. That leaves 3 other sections of the New Testament: Gospels, Acts, and the Apocalypse. We've got 4 sections there. The epistles would be the 4th section. All right, let's start discussing these men in order. First of all, I'm the chairman, William Barlow. William Barlow, B-A-R-L-O-W. We don't have many important men in this group, but probably Barlow would stand out as the most important. He was born in 1565. He died in 1613. He was 39 years of age at the time of the translation. He was a doctor and Dean of Chester. He had studied at St. John's College in Cambridge and had been a fellow at Trinity College from 1590 to 1596. So many of these schools are still in existence today in England, and they go back so long in history. My professor of theology in seminary had been a professor at Trinity. He had a doctor's degree from Notre Dame. He was a Pennsylvanian, but he had taught over at Trinity. Barlow received his doctor's degree, Doctor of Divinity, a D.D., in 1599, and had served as a chaplain to Archbishop Whitgift as well as Queen Elizabeth. He did not like the Puritans. He was an Anglican. More of these men are Anglicans than Puritans. One historical note about him that I can read a paragraph on: he was one of the 3 required chaplains to witness the execution of a man, the Earl of Essex, on February the 23rd, 1601. So his translating work was not interrupted by this execution, but we see so many of these men witnessing the execution of other men. The only reason I'm reading this account is to throw in something that's a little more interesting than just all of the boring statistics. 3 chaplains, of whom Barlow was one, heard the condemned lord recite the creed on the scaffold. The Earl of Essex, so tall, so youthful-looking, so blond, clad in scarlet, lay down, and after a moment gave the sign for the end by thrusting out his scarlet arms. The mighty axeman, this was not hanging, this was lopping off of the head. The mighty axeman thrice raised the axe in a mighty curve and thrice smashed it down. He was so frightened that he first slashed the Earl through the shoulder, then through the head. You would hate to die that way. And at last through the neck in a fashion most grisly. Stooping, the axeman lifted the bloody head, held it high for all to see, and roared, as was his final duty, "God save the Queen." Elizabeth was still on the throne here by a couple of years. You were supposed to pick, the most depraved of men to do that, so he was not squeamish and a stomach that would turn. You would hope that he would do it in one swing. So Barlow is not the one killed now. Barlow is the one who observes the execution of someone else. He ends up as Bishop of Rochester from 1605 to 1608, and Bishop of Lincoln from 1608 to 1613. That means he goes through some ecclesiastical promotions during the work of his translation. He dies in 1613, so he dies as Bishop of Lincoln. He was one of the men who lived a long way from Westminster, William Barlow. So he had quite a commute to get there on a regular or fairly regular basis. Barlow is best known as the historian for Hampton Court Conference. It's to him we're indebted for the notes he took, giving us something of what took place during this conference, because all of the official English minutes and records were destroyed in a fire, as I've given you before. He was an Arminian in theology, and so it's interesting that he was chairman of the committee that gave us Romans and Ephesians, books like that. For books like that to have come from the pen of an Arminian, and especially the chairman of the committee, is rather interesting. At least we could say he translated fairly, though. That's for sure. But it's rather difficult to water down Romans 9, 10, and 11 and Ephesians chapter 1. So he was honest enough just to say, well, here's what it said. I don't believe what it said, but here's what it said. All right, a second man, William Dakins. D-A-K-I-N-S. He died in 1607. So he was one of the men who died during the translating work. He was a Mr. Fellow at Trinity College in London. Number 3, so we're just working our way right down this list. All these men are the ones who gave us such a famous part of the KJV that you're probably more familiar with than any other part, the epistles of the New Testament, Romans through Jude. Number 3, Roger Fenton, F-E-N-T-O-N. He was born in 1565, which makes him 39, one of the younger of the men who did the KJV. He was a doctor, a fellow at Pembroke Hall in Cambridge. Very bright man and a very popular preacher of his day. Number 4, Ralph Hutchinson. Ralph Hutchinson, 1549 to 1606. Note again, another one that dies during the work, not in the preliminary stage, so that he has to be replaced from 1604 to, well, yes, he does, to 1607, because he dies in 1606. He's 55 at the time of the work. The other man we just discussed actually dies in 1607. He was a doctor, Archdeacon of St. Albans. He had been president of St. John's College, Oxford. He dies during the early stages of the work, but he did leave a few notes on the New Testament which still exist today, some of his preliminary work, which probably was used by the other translators, but his notes still exist today. It appears as though the notes were used by John Boyce, B-O-I-S-E, who worked on the Apocrypha at Cambridge, and who will become one of the more important men, as we will see later on. We have a while to go to get to the Cambridge group. We're going WOC order, Westminster, Oxford, Cambridge. He was a personal friend of John Reynolds, the father of the KJV. Number 5, Michael Rabbitt, R-A-B-B-E-T-T. Mr. Trinity College, Cambridge. Number 6, Thomas Sanderson. Thomas Sanderson. Doctor, who taught at Oxford. Number 7, and finally, we finish this group then, a very short group, non-important group as far as the men are concerned. He was born in 1559, makes him 45 at the time of the work. And all we know is he died shortly after 1611. I don't know the exact year, but he lives through the translation, through its publication. He dies shortly after that. John Spencer. He succeeded John Reynolds as president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Reynolds is president, and then John Spencer becomes president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford. He took his B.A. in 1577, Doctor of Divinity in 1602, which makes him a doctor just prior to beginning work on the KJV. An Anglican who hated the Puritans as much as he did the Roman Catholics. He was known for his great use of metaphors in preaching. One of his particular sermons, he warned against prosperity in the church. He said that as the church in general prospered, that it became morally lax and corrupt. It's probably a good observation. Amen. He said that's what happens when the church becomes prosperous. Now, at Corpus Christi College today, if you're ever in Oxford, there's a statue of John Spencer, and there's a statue of John Reynolds, two presidents of the school. With the latter holding the Old Testament closed in his hands, and the former with the New Testament opened in his. Now, none of these men are really that outstanding. Barlow is the chairman. He's really not outstanding, but he's more so than the other 6 men in this group. It's interesting that such a non-illustrious group of men gave us what, in most people's eyes, is the most important part of the KJV, of the New Testament epistles. All of the corpus of Paul's writing, which is the theology of the New Testament that interprets all of the Old Testament for us, and you'd have to argue that probably the epistles are the most important part of the Bible. We've got the least important group of men giving us the most important section in the KJV, the New Testament epistles. Most of those epistles written by Paul, and most of those epistles translated by Anglicans who are Arminians, who worked on this team. Of course, headed by William Barlow, the chairman, who was an Arminian himself. Paul is the theologian of predestination par excellence. He was certainly not an Arminian. And the men who translated all of his predestinarian works were Arminians, such as Romans 9, 10, and 11, and Ephesians chapter 1. So see, that's interesting to know. You know something about the honesty of some of these men, at least in their work of translation. We may have the Dutch Thompson, who's a drunkard on the side. At least he's not on this team, though. He's on the Old Testament team at Westminster. But they're faithful in giving us the predestinarian slant in Paul's writings. All right, let's come to a big Roman numeral 2 then. It won't take us too long, maybe 2 or 3 messages, and I'm sure we'll be through. Maybe one more after this morning. We'll have to see how far we can go. Maybe we'll finish it this morning. And we'll be through with all of these men. So number 2 will take us into Oxford. We're through with the Westminster group. You won't remember a lot of this, but for now, if you don't remember anything else, just remember what portions they give us. They give us the Pentateuch and the historical books of the Old Testament and the epistles of the New. Again, we're talking about Old Testament, New Testament. The Old's given to 3 groups, the New is to 2, and the Apocrypha to the remaining 1 of the 6. The Old Testament had 7 men, the New Testament had 8, for a total of 15. So far, 7 is our lowest number, and 10 for Genesis to Kings. The Old Testament part of Westminster group was the largest one. All right, Old Testament, what do you think they gave us? Just be a guess, of course. Isaiah to Malachi. Westminster gives us the first section of the Old Testament. Oxford gives us the last section of the Old Testament. And Cambridge will give us right in the middle. Isaiah to Malachi. In other words, the prophetical section. All of the prophets, the major and the minor prophets, were given to us by these men. Number 1, there are 7 men. And then I think I might add one more onto this later, but 7 men to start off with. Number 1, Richard Brett. B-R-E-T-T. Richard Brett. 1567 to 1637. Makes him one of the younger men. He was 37 when the work began. A doctor, a fellow at Lincoln College. Number 2, Daniel Featley. F-E-A-T-L-E-Y. Daniel Featley. F-E-A-T-L-E-Y. However, he was born Daniel Fairclough. F-A-I-R-C-L-O-U-G-H. Changed his name somewhere along the line. He was a mister, a fellow at New College. Some historians of the men of the KJV have argued that Featley was too young to have been a translator. And others have said that for whatever reason, we wish to assign he simply was not a translator. But we know we've got a man younger than him. We don't know how young Featley was. We know he was young. Samuel Ward was 27. He's the youngest man in the group, and surely Featley's not that young. So that's really not an argument. Featley does appear on the British Museum's list of the KJV translators. So it just goes to show how difficult it is to prove the participation of some of the lesser-known figures here. I mean, it's beyond dispute that John Reynolds and John Overall and Lancelot Andrews and John Boyce and all of these men are involved. That's beyond dispute. Some of the lesser-known, less important figures, there's a lot more dispute about. But we're going to include him because he's included on the list in the British Museum. Number 3, John Harding. By the way, John is the most popular name through it all, as you probably have already noticed. John Harding, doctor, president of Magdalen College, which is where C.S. Lewis taught. President of Magdalen College. We've discussed him a little bit before. He was one of the 3 men selected by the king to draw up the list of translators. Was a Hebrew scholar. He was a Puritan. president of Magdalen College for only 1 year, and that is the year of his death. He was appointed as president and died the same year, and he was succeeded by Richard Kilby, which will be the fifth man we discuss here under Oxford Old Testament. And maybe most important for right here, John Harding was chairman of the Oxford Old Testament group. I decided to give the names to you in alphabetical order instead of starting with the chairman. John Harding was chairman of this group, Isaiah to Malachi. All of the great servant songs in Isaiah, well, these are the men responsible for those. Number 4, Thomas Holland. Holland. Thomas Holland. 1538, which makes him 66. He died 1 year after the work, 1612. One of the older translators at 66, by the way. He was a doctor, and he was rector of Exeter College. Exeter. Exeter College. He was a strong Calvinist, schooled in the church fathers and in the early churchmen. Biographical note of him is that he perhaps had more personal piety than is clearly seen in so many of the others. Thomas Holland, he's not really well known at all, but he seems to have a lot of personal piety. Every time he took a journey and left his friends, he would leave them with this saying in Latin: I commend you to the love of God and to the hatred of popery and superstition. That seems to be part of his superstitious parting. Every time he would leave someone, he would leave them with that statement in Latin. Always quote that whenever it was time to take a trip. I commend you to the love of God and to the hatred of popery and superstition. So being a Calvinist, he would obviously be a hater of Roman Catholicism. Kilby, which is the next man we're going to discuss, preached his funeral service. Kilby succeeds Harding as president of Magdalen College, and he has a role in Thomas Holland's life, or rather death, because he preaches his funeral service. So, number 5, Richard Kilby, Kilby. Richard Kilby, Kilby. He died in 1620. Mr. Rector of Lincoln College. He had a very interesting sermon that has come down to us today that he entitled The Burden of a Loaden Conscience, like we would say loaded, L-O-A-D-E-N, The Burden of a Loaden Conscience. And what this sermon was about, he preached it everywhere. It seems to be so autobiographical that it was just instilled in him, almost a terror and a fear that he couldn't get away from. He was much buffeted by guilt over his past sins, because he said that he enjoyed sinning so much and kind of missed that past life. And so he was a little guilty over the fact that not only did he miss a little bit, somewhat of his past life, but just the thought of enjoying sin so much whenever he did it before he was, converted. So he probably would have been a good one to work on a book like Lamentations. That was assigned to their group, Lamentations. He was a very precise translator, chose his words very precisely. Number 6 in the Oxford Old Testament group, John Reynolds. The greatest name of all of the men in the history of the KJV, except perhaps King James himself. John Reynolds, born 1549, died 1607. The father of the KJV dies whenever the work begins. He was 55 when the work began in 1604. He was a doctor, president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. If you remember nothing else about him, remember this: the Puritan father of the KJV. the Puritan father of the KJV, John Reynolds. R-E-Y-N-O-L-D-S. He was a leading Puritan teacher of Calvinism. Of course, Puritanism and Calvinism are not synonymous, but if you were a Puritan, you were Calvinistic in theology. He was a leading Puritan teacher of Calvinism, a man of a huge intellect, and no small piety as well. His contemporaries referred to him by this phrase, a living library, the third university. He had an exhaustive encyclopedic memory. The third, and that would be in addition to Oxford and Cambridge, and the third library is the mind of John Reynolds. An exhaustive encyclopedic memory. Could converse on any topic, anytime, anywhere, to anyone. That was literally true of him. And his contemporaries called him a living library. You've heard of people today being called a walking computer. Well, I guess it's similar. They didn't have computers then, so he was referred to as a living library. The third university. As you would list your schools, you would say Oxford, Cambridge, John Reynolds. So I guess some people's idea of the Puritans is they were, since they were anti-Anglican calls and anti-Roman Catholic precedents, and then probably the Puritans were ignoramuses or something. No, they had some of the world's leading scholars in their midst. The Puritans were no dummies. They were led by some of the world's leading scholars. Lancelot Andrewes was certainly intelligent, has to be ranked as one of the most intelligent men of his day, but John Reynolds was in no whit a step behind him. Like most of these people, he had come from a Roman Catholic family and converted to Protestantism. His most famous pupil was Richard Hooker. Richard Hooker, who penned a very famous work in that day that's still available today, entitled The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which championed the Anglican position. So it's a little ironic that the greatest pupil of Reynolds, a famous name in Anglican English history, Richard Hooker, came from him. Richard Hooker. Reynolds was familiar with all of the Latin and Greek fathers. He had read them all thoroughly. He had even written a commentary on Aristotle and his philosophy. Let me read you a few things from another man's biography of him, give you some of the flavor of Reynolds and his preaching and his piety. In 1586, Reynolds, sometimes I think I've said before, you'll see his name spelled R-A-I-N, like Rain Olds, O-L-D-S. Reynolds began lectures at 20 pounds a year to confute Romish tenets. Many hearers came 3 times a week, and those who believed as he did, and those that believed as he did, that he was doing a great good. In 1592, he began an assault on stage plays. I thought this was really interesting about him. They'd be similar to, they'd be comparable to the theater or to motion pictures and TV today. In 1566, going back in his life, when Reynolds was a student at Oxford, Queen Elizabeth had paid a visit to the university. At Corpus Christi College, a play composed for her was acted with Reynolds, then 17 years old, playing the role of a female. And as you probably know from this time in history, women had no role in the theater. Men dressed up as women and played the role of girls and women. The Queen enjoyed the performance, laughing much and thanking the author for his pains. Now, nearly 30 years after, Reynolds could not forgive himself for acting the part of a girl. Nearly all his pamphlet, entitled The Overthrow of Stage Plays, was about how unlawful it was for men to wear women's clothing and for people to see such shameful make-believe. To him, unlawful meant against the Bible. Had not the law of God in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 5 forbidden a man to put on woman's clothing? But for some years more, the English stage would continue to present boy actors in women's parts. Of course, using boys because their voice had not changed yet, and they would serve well for women. You couldn't use an older man. You'd have to choose a 17-year-old boy. Maybe his voice was cracking along there, but it would still sound enough like a woman. On the plays themselves, Reynolds would write, this is a quote from him, and see if this isn't an exact picture of what we have today. They saw this not with television, but with just a stage way back in those days, that many hundreds of years ago. They meditate how they may inflame a tender youth with love, entice him to dalliance, to whoredom, to incest, inure their minds and bodies to uncomely, dissolute, railing, boasting, knavish, foolish, brainsick, drunken conceits, words, and gestures. Later the Puritans were to close the theaters of England, which would open again in the reign of Charles II, more corrupt and obscene than ever. And I think it was Cyprian, the early church father and the early church writer, if I remember correctly, my memory would say that he said adultery was learned by watching it acted in the plays. This is way back in the first few centuries A.D. But where people learned adultery and fornication is they went to the plays and watched it. And we're going to use these two references, so you'll remember them, I'm sure. We'll use them again very soon in Christian ethics. Because this isn't something new that people are concerned about and thinking about today. It's just history's repeating itself again. Amen. You're finally hearing an outroar against television. You're finally hearing an outroar in the last 5 or 10 years against that. But this has been going on ever since people have acted out such base, obscene stories. He was, Reynolds, opposed to the sign of the cross at baptism. He was opposed to the use of the Apocrypha, and he was opposed to what was then referred to as the churching of women. You'll probably never guess, unless you've studied history, what the churching of women was. It sounds like maybe women preachers or something. The churching of women, you know what that was? Allowing the women in the church, keep those rascals out. No, they were allowed in, that was okay. The churching of women. The formal process of thanksgiving that a woman would come and give after childbirth. It was a very formal liturgical thing with the right steps and maneuvers, and you would say the right words to thank God after childbirth. I doubt that Reynolds was really opposed to women thanking God for childbirth, but he was opposed to the liturgy and the steps and everything used in that. So I just thought you'd find that interesting. I look for the things that may have some application to us, and sometimes you have to look a long time to find anything. But with all the women having children around here, you see, if we followed a certain formula and you had to turn and step and salute and everything as you gave your thing, well, Reynolds would be opposed to that. Something else that he chose to attack during his day was the excess of, entertainment and leisure. Here's his writing. You say that there is a time for sports, plays, dances, a time for earnest studies. The man consisteth not of one part alone, he hath body as well as mind. Well, time of recreation is necessary, I grant, and think as necessary for scholars that are scholars indeed, I mean good students, as it is for any. Yet, in my opinion, it were not fit for them to play at stool ball among the wenches with idle, nor at mum chance and mall, which was a card game then, with idle loose companions, nor at trunks in guild halls, various games that they played then. And you'll see what his critique is as we work our way through this. Nor to dance about the maypole, nor to rifle, which was gambling with dice, in the alehouses, nor to carouse in taverns, nor to rob orchards. This was what they did for a lot of fun then. In other words, what he was really opposed to was the fact that it wasn't just entertainment or leisure, but they were spending their leisure and entertainment time with unbelievers. They were going to their sports activities, to their leisure activities, and spending a lot of time with them. And he said, I admit that recreation is necessary for a scholar. We're made up of more than just mind. We're made up of body as well. But he said, I'm opposed to robbing orchards and gambling with dice, not only things that he thought obviously were bad in themselves, but some of these other games played with unbelievers. John Milton, you've heard of John Milton in history, writer of Paradise Lost. John Milton always referred to John Reynolds as, I quote, our famous Dr. Reynolds. And of course, more people in history have heard of John Milton than John Reynolds. He's more famous than Reynolds. So that shows you what Milton thought of Reynolds. His eminence was higher than Milton's. Milton referred to him as, quote, our famous Dr. Reynolds. I mean, Reynolds was so well known and so intelligent, he was respected highly even by his enemies. Another writer refers to him as, quote, the very treasury of erudition. Another refers to him as, quote, nearly, if not altogether, the most learned man in England. That would place him above Lancelot Andrewes. I mean, I don't know who was the more intelligent of the two. Give them an SAT exam or something. I don't know which was the most intelligent of those two men, but it could be argued that either one was more eminent than the other. I don't think we'd have enough material. We'd need the two men and their brains, I guess. But it is interesting to know that the man who was a Puritan, who is the father of the KJV, was not a whit behind any other man in the world of his day for erudition, intelligence, knowledge. His will is still at Corpus Christi College, written out in his own hand. Let me see. It's interesting what was in his will. Here's what he left to people. Let's see, he gave 100 of his books to Corpus Christi College. To the Bodleian Library, he gave 40. To other colleges, Queen's, Merton, New University, Oriel, Exeter, Trinity, he gave many more. There was a special bequest of books to Sir Henry Saville. We'll look at him before too long, fellow translator and a high churchman. To the one who would succeed him as head of Corpus Christi College, he left his map of England, his linen and woolen bedding and lesser household things, and his notebooks about the college. To friends he gave his private notebooks, papers, letters, and writings to make away with those which could do no good and to publish only those lectures which he had finished. His books were valued at £774, 10 shillings. His maps of England, Europe, Asia, Africa, and America were worth £8 and 8 shillings. His early map of America before Virginia or Plymouth was settled would be worth a fortune today. Among his other precious things were the following: a silver bottle, a watch, a signet, a pair of bellows, some sugar and ginger, a penknife, wax papers, and clothes. He had gowns with hoods faced with velvet, 12 pairs of stockings, a rug and a blanket, 12 fine towels, 2 pairs of silk garters, a muff, some clothes, and other maybe stranger objects set down in writing too difficult to read. There was no surplice on the list. That was this religious garb they had to wear, the religious habiliments, though he had conformed enough to wear one. In some they were the simple, useful goods of an eminent but quite devout scholar. So we actually have a list of the very things that he left. Okay, back to another man here. Reynolds, we take a little longer time on. Number 7, Miles Smith. Number 7, Miles Smith. Dies 1624, Doctor, Canon of Hereford. Hereford. Now, it just so happens that these important men are kind of bunched together. He has to rank with Lancelot Andrewes as far as his brilliance is concerned, Miles Smith. He has to rank with John Reynolds, the father of the KJV, as far as the role he played in the translation work. In other words, I would list the 3 most important men in one of these 2 orders: John Reynolds, Miles Smith, Lancelot Andrewes, or Miles Smith, John Reynolds, Lancelot Andrewes. Andrewes the third. It's a toss-up between Reynolds and Smith as the first. Reynolds, well, he should be put first because of his great intelligence, and he fathered the KJV. Miles Smith put first because of his great intelligence and because he concluded the KJV. But those are the three men to remember. And Lancelot Andrewes less than these other two. Miles Smith, a word or two about him, had an extraordinary knowledge of the biblical languages. He was the last man engaged in the translating work. He was one of the two final editors, Thomas Bilson being the other, Bilson not being one of the translators. Now, since he kind of worked as final editor, that means that he, along with Bilson, but he to a much larger degree, like 80-20 as far as percentage is concerned, he had a hand in the final saying of everything. He did not only work on this certain group that had to deal with this certain portion, the Old Testament, Isaiah to Malachi, but as the final editor, he gets to look over everything and then not have to take his work before some final committee. So it probably could be argued that we would see the hand of Miles Smith in the KJV more than any other man. You normally see the hand of the editor more than any other contributor to the work that's under consideration. He also did the preface, for which he was made Bishop of Gloucester on September the 20th, 1612. The work of the preface was solely from his hand. And for this, he was made Bishop of Gloucester on September the 20th in 1612. Now, the preface at one time was printed in all editions of the KJV, entitled The Translators to the Reader. And I would argue that it should continue today, but it no longer does. Most of the time, if you have anything, and some of you don't, you have the well-known dedicatory epistle to the Most High and Mighty Prince, James, which is worthless in comparison to the preface entitled The Translators to the Reader. And we will study that paragraph by paragraph later. And we'll show you more later as we come to the conclusion of the work, just the role that the hand of one Miles Smith played as final editor in the KJV. And I think that we could argue that we perhaps see more of him than any other man. He was a Calvinist in affiliation, but as far as denominational background, he existed somewhere between Puritans and Anglicans. Not totally a Puritan, but not totally an Anglican. In other words, he was a very balanced, as they would say, a mild-mannered, balanced man. But at least he was Calvinist and not Arminian. Now, then I would add, that's 7 names, right? That's all that we have here in the Old Testament. Then I would add here, after we've gone 1 through 7, just a little A down here. We'll put one more name on here that we're not really counting with the big men. And this is William Thorne. Thorne. William Thorne. He was an early translator that appears only in a very few places, but he never appears on any of the official lists. So here's where all the numbers of 54, 57, 48, 49, here's where all this becomes so confusing. And that's why it is so confusing, the disparity we see in comparing the various lists. William Thorne. I don't count him as one of the Oxford men, but I list him here because he did work Oxford Old Testament. But that can only be, if we could even use the term proven, from a very few and insignificant places. All right, let me kind of sum up this group. We see that 2 of the 3 greatest luminaries of the KJV come from the Oxford Old Testament Isaiah to Malachi group, John Reynolds and Miles Smith. So they happen to be bunched together right here. They're bunched together as 6 and 7 because of the spelling of their last name alphabetically. We happen to see the 3 great luminaries, throwing in Lancelot Andrewes as well, in the Old Testament field. Not in the New, not in the Apocrypha. The 3 great names of Reynolds, Smith, and Andrewes are in Old Testament. The first portion, Andrewes, from Genesis to Kings. The last portion, Isaiah to Malachi, these 2 men, John Reynolds and Miles Smith. 2 from an Oxford group, 1 from a Westminster group. Okay, let's jump over to the New Testament. And we will have 1 through 8, and then some A's and B's under that. What did they do? This New Testament group at Oxford. The Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. They had to do the rest of it because the other committee is reserved for the Apocrypha. The New's only given to 2. Westminster B group, Oxford B group. Westminster group does the epistles, Romans to Jude. The Oxford B New Testament group, Gospels, Acts, and the Apocalypse. So here we get all the life of Christ, the history of the early church, and the eschatology of the Apostle John. First man, George Abbott, A-B-B-O-T, George Abbott, 1562 to 1633. 42 at the time of the work, a doctor, and in the year 1600 he was Dean of Winchester. Through his life and through the time of the KJV work, he held different positions. Let's see, I guess that's probably how I would characterize Abbott. He was a great ecclesiastical leader. He was a scholar, but more of an ecclesiastical leader. Held great high positions in the church. He was master of University College and vice-chancellor of that college 3 times. Master of University College and vice-chancellor of that college 3 times. In 1609, during the work of the KJV, he became Dean of Lichfield, and Bishop of London. Dean of Lichfield and Bishop of London. And in 1611, the date of the publication of the KJV, he became the only one of these 57 men to reach the zenith of the churchmen, and that was Archbishop of Canterbury. Bancroft had already been there. That's really the zenith of ecclesiastical leadership in England of this day. It was Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, historians of his life say no surprise, because his mother, years earlier, as a matter of fact, in the year 1562, had dreamed a dream when she was pregnant with George Abbott, that if, while pregnant, she would go catch a pike, or a jack is what they were called, a type of fish. If she would go to the river and catch a jack and eat it by the river's bank, that the child in her to be born would be a boy, and that he would rise to the greatest heights in the Church of England. So she did, and he did. She went and caught and ate the jack, and he became Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a strong Calvinist with Puritan leanings, which is interesting. Not so much Anglican, but with Puritan leanings. Not tolerant of the RCs at all. His argument against the Roman Catholics was that even their name was nonsensical. Roman Catholic, I think I've even said this before, Rome was a local place, but Catholic meant universal. So he said even your name is a contradiction to be called the Roman Catholic Church. He was a good man that followed his conscience even when it got him into trouble. He took strong stands against Kings James and Charles. James for some of his policies and Charles for divorce. And I guess you can afford to do that if you're Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote a book on the discovery of North America and detailed in how the Indians worshipped demons and practiced witchcraft. He had never been to America, so he was probably just going from others' information. But he wrote a book on the discovery of North America. He had a brother, Thomas, who was also rather famous. Now, later in his life, this is after the KJV work, he had a bad hunting accident in the year 1621, where he accidentally killed a gamekeeper. He was deer hunting. He had warned this man to stay out of the park while he was hunting, and an arrow meant for a deer glanced off of a tree, struck the gamekeeper in the heart, and killed him. Now, according to canon law, he would be disqualified as a, quote, man of blood, so he would be stripped of his ecclesiastical office as Archbishop of Canterbury. That was according to canon law. That was the law of the church. That a man of blood, a man who had been a murderer or was a murderer, he would be stripped of his ecclesiastical office. So he was tried by a court of 8 men. Now, I don't know why you try by an even number. That never makes any sense, because you can always split 4-4, which is exactly what happened. You don't ever try by an even number. He was tried by a court of 8 men. They split 4-4. King James then had to cast the deciding vote, and he cast it in favor of this man, even though he had opposed James on some of his policies. But he was a man of piety. He lived the rest of his life with great remorse. He supported the gamekeeper's widow financially for the rest of her life, and took a monthly, I think like a 4 or 5 day fast for the rest of his life as penance over killing this gamekeeper. It was an accident, and it was a pure accident. He had even warned the man to stay out of the park. It was an accident that an arrow glanced off a tree and struck this man in the heart. But he supported the man's widow for the rest of her life and went on a half a week or week fast every month until he died. He lived long enough to crown the next king, Charles I, in 1625. As a writer, however, he was rather dull. Great church leader, but as a writer he was dull, which would mean as a translator he was rather dull. We'll discuss him more when we close the work out in 1611. Okay, number 2. John Aglionby. John Aglionby. Aglionby. 1566 to 1611. Was 38 at the time of the work. Doctor, Principal of Edmund Hall, Oxford. Principal of Edmund Hall, Oxford. He had been a fellow at Queen's College and served as a chaplain for both Elizabeth and James. And he was probably one of the replacements for an earlier man who had either died or moved away. Remember, 7 men either die or move away between 1604 and when the work begins in 1607, and they had to have some replacements. Aglionby was probably one of those replacements. Number 3, John Harmer. Harmer. John Harmer. 1555 to just after 1611. He was 49 at the time of the work. Doctor, fellow at New College. Harmer was probably one of the either 6 or 12 men to go over the rough draft at Stationers' Hall. So he probably worked on that revision committee. Known for translating Calvin's sermon on the 10 Commandments. You can find a big book in print today of Calvin's sermon on the 10 Commandments. and others of Theodore Beza's work into English. Number 4, Leonard Hutton, Hutton, 1557 to 1632, 47 at the time of the work. Vicar of Flore, Floore, in 1601. Along with Aglionby, he was probably another early replacement. And by the way, all of the replacements were staunch Anglicans. He wrote a treatise defending the sign of the cross. Reynolds was opposed to that. Most of the Puritans were. He served as chaplain to Bancroft, Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury. Bancroft. And he lived to be 75. One of the longer living of the men. Lived to be 75. Number 5, John Perrin. Another John. John Perrin. P-E-R-I-N. Doctor, fellow at St. John's College. Number 6, Thomas Ravis, R-A-V-I-S, 1560 to 1609. 44, Doctor, Dean of Christ Church. And he was the chairman of the Oxford New Testament group, Gospels, Acts, the Apocalypse. Thomas Ravis was the chairman of the group. Very stern, very arrogant, very gruff, very anti-Puritan. He had been a chaplain to Archbishop Whitgift. Later, after the KJVs has begun, he would become Bishop of Gloucester. The biographical note is that he spent lavishly the money that he had.